The black sky burned with fire as the human ship fell from the stars, and the air was hot and dry, and the smoke from the broken engines painted. The clouds in red and orange and black, and the wind carried the echo of the crash far across the dead. Alien Landryan was a soldier from Earth. And this was not his mission, and this was not his place, and his ship was not supposed to come here, but something hit it during the fight. And the ship lost power, and the fire came, and then the fall began. He was bleeding from the side, and his leg was twisted, and every step felt like walking on fire in the cold. Sweat on his forehead mixed with the dust of the broken planet, and the sound of the metal groaning behind him told him the ship would explode soon, and he had to move. He dragged his body across the dry, cracked ground, and the rocks around him were sharp like broken glass, and the sky was darker now and only small. Blinking lights floated above, and he thought maybe he was dreaming, or maybe he was dying. He saw a shape ahead, and it looked like ruins, or maybe a small temple, and he had read about the old alien cultures on this world long ago. Before the war, before the hate, and before the fire and the blood, and maybe someone still lived here, or maybe something. He entered the ruins, and the shadows swallowed him, and the walls were tall and curved like bones of a sleeping beast, and strange symbols glowed in soft blue light like the stars that fell with him, and it felt old and quiet and cold, but it was shelter, and right now that was all he needed. He fell near the center, and his back hit the stone, and he could not move anymore, and his breath came slow and rough, and he closed his eyes and whispered a name. Not even sure whose. It was maybe his sister, maybe someone from home, or maybe no one, but someone was watching from above, from the cracks and holes in the wall, and someone was holding their breath. Afraid to be seen, afraid to move, afraid to feel that old pain again. She was not like the others, not anymore, not since the war took her family and burned her world and left only ash. In her heart her name was Vera, and she was one of the ancient race from this planet, and long ago her kind was proud and wise and full of music and stories, but now she lived alone in silence and in fear. She saw the human enter the ruins, and she wanted to run and hide deeper into the caves, but something held her in place, and something pulled her closer, and something inside her felt the pain in his eyes and remembered her own pain. He looked young, not much older than her own son before the war, before the sky fell, and the soldiers came, and everything ended. And she saw blood on his side, and she saw how he could not breathe. And she knew he was dying. She whispered to herself that he was the enemy, that he should not be here, that this was her place, her temple, her sorrow. And yet she moved closer. Her hands glowed softly as she reached into her old healing bag, a gift from her mother, once used for life, now forgotten in the dust. And she stepped closer to the human and listened for breath and the beat of a weak heart. Ryan heard something in his sleep, maybe a voice, maybe wind, maybe memory, and he felt something warm near his chest and something gentle like light passing through water, and he opened his eyes just a little. He saw a shadow with eyes like stars, and he felt his pain fade a little, and he tried to speak, but only air came, and his mouth stayed open. And the shadow moved away fast like a ghost or a dream. Vera stepped back into the darkness, her heart beating like drums in her ears, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came, and she leaned against the stone wall and whispered to herself over and over that she did not help him, that she did not feel anything, that she did not care, but she knew the truth, and the truth was she could not let him die, not like this, not alone, and not here, not even if he was human outside the ruins. The night grew colder, and above them the stars watched in silence, and far away the sound of machines echoed across the land, and danger was coming again. But for now, in this small forgotten place, two lives had touched for the first time, one broken by war and the other by loss, and neither of them knew that everything was about to change forever. The night wrapped the ruins in silence, and only the low hum of energy from the broken human ship echoed in the distance like a forgotten warning that danger was near and time was short and life was not safe here. Vera stood in the shadows behind the old stone wall, her breath slow, her hands shaking, her heart beating like thunder in a cave filled with ghosts and sorrow and fear. She watched the human sleep, his body weak, his chest rising slow, his face pale and dirty, his leg twisted and bleeding, and yet there was something about him that made her stay and watch longer than she meant to. She hated what he was, not because he had harmed her, but because he was part of the world that had taken everything from her and burned the forest and poisoned the rivers and shattered the sky. with fire, but still she did not walk away, and still her hand reached toward him again, carrying the old cloth soaked with healing water drawn from the roots of her ancestors, a method lost to many, but not to her, not to the widow who lived alone while the world forgot her name. She placed the cloth on his chest and let the water drip down slowly into his wounds. And she whispered words in her own tongue, old words, soft words, words used by mothers to calm crying children and by healers to guide life. Back into broken bodies the human shifted but did not wake, and she stepped back quickly, her heart jumping like it wanted to escape her chest and run back into the cave where no one could find it. She had not touched another being in many years, and she had not spoken to anyone in even longer, and now here she was hiding behind a wall, watching over a wounded human like some spirit cursed to protect strangers in the dark. Her mind screamed to leave, to close the entrance, to forget he was there, to pretend this never happened, but her feet stayed where they were and her eyes kept looking back to the soft rise and fall of his breath. She remembered a time when her mate came home from the borderlands wounded and silent, and she had used the same water, the same cloth, the same words, and he had smiled through pain and held her hand until the sun came, and now that hand was only memory, and that sun had not risen in years. He knelt again slowly, this time beside the human, her eyes scanning the marks on his jacket, the symbols of earth, the sign of the people who called her world a target and a resource and nothing more. He was the enemy by name, but not by action. Not now, not here, not while he bled and shivered and whispered broken words in his sleep, calling out to no one, or maybe to someone he once loved, someone he thought of while falling through fire and sky. She did not answer, but her hands moved again, now with more care, now with less fear, and she placed a root under his tongue, a healing root that would stop the fever before it reached his heart, and she wiped his forehead and pulled a cover over his chest made of old cloth stitched from robes of her people long gone. In that moment she saw not a soldier, not an invader, but something simple and lost, a soul hurt by war like her own, a life not so different from the one she used to know. She stood and walked back into the shadows, where her old home was carved into stone and filled with echoes of laughter that no longer came, and she lit a small light and sat down by the window and watched the stars move across the black sky. She thought of her son and how he used to run through the fields chasing wind creatures with wings like glass, and how he laughed when the sky was blue, and how he never got to grow old. The human moved again, this time sitting up halfway, groaning in pain and confusion, and Vera watched without breathing as he blinked and looked around the temple, his eyes wide and searching and scared. He called out into the silence, a soft call, a question, not with words but with feeling, with fear and wonder and loneliness mixed together like dust and wind in a storm. Vera did not answer, but she stepped close enough for him to see her shadow and nothing more, and he froze, and his eyes locked on the shape just barely seen in the dim light of the temple. Who are you? He asked with a voice dry and weak, and Vera stayed silent because her voice was not ready yet, and her heart was not steady yet, and the pain inside her still whispered that trust was a dangerous thing. She turned and left without a word, her cloak trailing behind her like a wave of memory, and she told herself again that she would not return, that this was enough, that she had done her part, and that she owed him nothing. But even as she lay on the cold floor of her cave with her eyes closed and her hands pressed over her chest, she knew the truth. She would return again, and she would watch again, and maybe, just maybe, she would speak, because something inside her had moved, something that had not moved in a long time, something that sounded almost like hope. The morning came without color, and the sky above the ruins stayed gray, like smoke floating over forgotten battlefields, and the wind carried no sound and no warmth and no sign of life beyond the broken walls and scattered stones that whispered of stories never finished. Tryon opened his eyes to the heavy silence and found the air thin and strange, like breathing through a dream, and his head ached like it held the weight of a planet, in his chest felt tight and empty and cold, as if something had been taken from him and something else had been given in return. He remembered crashing and falling and crawling and bleeding, and then the memory turned soft and cloudy and quiet like water running over glass, and he remembered hands, or maybe just the feeling of hands, and something warm pressing against his wound, and a voice not in words but in kindness. He tried to sit, and pain shot through his leg like fire through dry wood, and he cried out, though no one answered, and the sound of his voice felt too loud in the temple, like shouting in a graveyard where even echoes fear to stay. He looked around and saw strange symbols on the walls, glowing faint blue like stars underwater, and the floor was made of smooth stone with cracks shaped like vines and roots in time itself, and above him the roof opened to the sky through a circle broken at the edges like the teeth of some ancient beast. There was no food, no tools, no weapons, no signal, and yet beside him lay a folded cloth, soaked in something that smelled like earth and light and peace, and there was a hollow shell of fruit and a flat stone plate with pieces of dry root that had clearly been placed, not dropped and not forgotten. Someone was here, and someone had helped him, and someone was still watching, maybe from the shadows, maybe from a distance, maybe from a place he could not understand. He whispered thank you into the silence, not expecting an answer, but hoping the one who had saved him was close enough to hear, close enough to know that he was not afraid, and that he meant no harm. Far above, hidden between the broken upper walls, Vera watched without moving, her eyes locked on the human, her breath shallow, her fingers tight around the old edge of her shawl, woven with threads from a time when her name was spoken with love, not with silence. She told herself not to come again, but her feet had moved without asking, and her heart had pulled her like a lost child reaching for the last light in the dark, and now she was here, again, watching this human, watching his pain and his confusion and his strange way of speaking to nothing. She saw him eat the root and drink the water, and though his face twisted at the bitter taste, he kept going, and her mouth curled just a little. Not quite a smile and not quite sadness, but something between, something quiet and berry dry, and stood slowly, leaning on a carved pillar, and looked around the ruin, touching the symbols on the wall with care like they were alive and sacred. And he stopped at one mark shaped like a circle within a flame, and stared for a long moment as if it spoke a secret. Only he could hear. Vera knew that mark. It was the seal of her family, a symbol carved into the walls by her own mate on the day they built this place together, as a place of peace, a place for healing and stories and dreams, before war turned it into a shelter for ghosts. Ryan turned and looked at the shadows and spoke again, not loud, not strong, but true and full of something really. No, you are here, and I do not know who you are, but thank you for helping me. I'm not your enemy, and I do not want to fight. Vera felt her throat tighten, and her hand moved to her chest where the necklace of stone and glass lay, hidden under her robe, a gift from her son, carved with love and shaped like a leaf from the first tree he ever climbed. She wanted to speak, but her voice stayed behind her teeth like a bird too afraid to fly, and instead she took a small satchel of dried leaves and dropped it from the broken edge where she stood, letting it fall near him like a message from the wind. Ryan looked up and saw nothing but the falling leaves, and he stepped forward and picked up the satchel with slow hands and a calm heart, and he looked up again and said, you saved me again, and I want to know your name. Vera turned and walked away through the hidden passage into the deeper part of the ruins where light never came, and where she kept the things that still reminded her of life. Before everything turned to ash, she whispered to herself the name he wanted, and it sounded like a melody once sung by her people, and she wondered if she would ever let it be heard again behind her. Ryan sat near the wall and held the satchel close like a gift from a friend he had never seen, and for the first time since falling from the sky, he smiled just a little, not because he was safe, not because he was healed, not because the danger was over, but because he was no longer alone. The wind changed, and the dust moved in slow circles, like whispers circling the bones of a forgotten world, and high above the clouds stretched thin across the sky like old scars on skin that no longer felt pain, and in the stillness of morning a sound rose from the horizon, soft at first, but growing louder like drums calling something ancient back to life. Ryan heard it while placing small stones in a line near the temple center, his hands steady, his breath calm, but his body tense as if something deep inside had been waiting for this sound for far too long, and now that it came he knew it was not wind and not storm and not chance. The sound was metal on stone boots and rhythm voices carried through machines, the low hum of scanners, sweeping through silence like blind wolves searching for heat, for breath, for weakness, and the earth seemed to hold its breath as they drew closer in the dark of her hidden chamber. Vera stood frozen, her eyes wide, her heart slow, her hands gripping the edge of the ancient table carved with the stories of her people, stories of birth and stars and peace before the fire before. The sky turned red and the ground split open and everything that mattered was taken. She knew that sound and she knew what came with it, and her mind returned to the last time she heard it, the day they came for her village, the day they took her mate and her son and left behind only ruins and ash and silence. She moved quickly, gathering what little she had and pressing her ear to the stone wall, listening to the pattern, the pace, the number of feet, the number of voices, the number of machines. And she closed her eyes and whispered, "No, not now, not again." Above her the wind brought the scent of fuel and heat and smoke, and Ryan stood tall and still near the broken doorway, his eyes scanning the distance and his thoughts spinning fast. And he knew soldiers when he heard them, and he knew these were not human, these were something else. Something older, something that walked with pride and suspicion. They would not care that he had no weapon and no orders and no will to fight. They would only see a human on sacred ground, and that would be enough. He looked up toward the place where the satchel had fallen days before, and he said in a voice low and calm, "I think they are coming for me, and I do not want to bring danger to your world. And if I must go, I will go alone." Vera heard his words through the wind and the stone, and for a moment her fear pulled her backward into the cold, safe shadows, but something inside her broke through the fear, and she moved like water through narrow paths, through tunnels carved by her ancestors with fire and song, until she stood behind the wall closest to him. Her voice came not loud, but clear like the first light after long night, and she said, "If they find you here, they will burn this place. And they will never leave, and I will lose what little is left." Ryan turned, but saw only the shape of her cloak behind the stone, and he said, "I am sorry, I never meant to stay, I only wanted to heal and to thank you." Vera stepped from the shadow, just enough for the light to touch her face, and for the first time Ryan saw her eyes full of silence, full of storms, full of something he could not name, and she said, "Then run now, run far and fast, before they come too close." But he did not move, because he saw what she was hiding, not just fear, but memory, and he said, "I do not want to leave you, and I will not let them take this place." Vera almost smiled, almost cried, almost shouted at his foolishness, but the sky above them cracked with the sound of the first scout ship breaking through the clouds, and her body moved before her thoughts, and she grabbed his arm and pulled him into the hidden path behind the pillar carved with the symbol of her family. They moved through the tunnel, her feet silent, his steps uneven but quick, and behind them the dust began to rise and voices echoed through the ruins, shouting in a language Ryan could not understand, but Vera knew every word and every meaning and every threat. They reached the chamber deep under the temple, and she pressed her hand to the wall, and a door of stone slid closed, hiding them in silence and in darkness, broken only by the soft glow of the crystal in her palm. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither spoke. And yet, in that silence, 1,000 thoughts passed between them like fireflies dancing in a storm above them. The soldiers spread through the ruins, searching, burning, touching, breaking, and one of them found the line of stones Ryan had left and bent down to look, and stood again with his weapon drawn, eyes sharp, voice louder, calling the others. But Ryan was gone, and the temple kept its secret, and Vera held her breath, not for herself, but for the stranger who had become more than a guest and more than a burden, and maybe even more than a memory. And in the darkness, Ryan whispered, "Thank you again," and Vera whispered back, "Not yet." The silence in the hidden chamber felt heavy like water without light, pressing on skin and bone and thought and breath, and Ryan sat on the smooth stone floor with his back against the wall and his hands resting on his knees, and his heart slowly calming after the chase that almost ended everything. Vera stood nearby with her eyes closed and her fingers still glowing faint from the seal she had activated on the stone door, and her mind raced through memories like wind through broken leaves, searching for something steady, something solid, something safe outside. The footsteps had faded, and the voices had turned to static whispers floating back into the sky, where machines hummed and engines burned and orders echoed in the ears of soldiers who searched for things they did not understand and feared what they could not see. Ryan looked at Vera, not speaking, just watching her face, the way the light touched her skin like silver over stone, and the way her body never seemed still, always listening, always ready, always halfway between leaving and staying. And he felt a weight In his chest not pain, not fear, something slower, something warmer. She opened her eyes and met his gaze without words, and for a long moment they sat in that silence, not needing sound, because everything loud had already passed, and everything that mattered now lived in quiet moments like this. He broke the silence with a whisper, not a question, not a demand, only a truth. I did not think you would come for me, but you did, and I do not know. Rivera looked away as if the truth was written on the wall behind him, and she walked to a shelf carved into the stone and picked up a small round fruit covered in soft gold skin and placed it beside him and said, "Because something in me still believes not in war, not in peace, not even in tomorrow. Just in now, just in this." Ryan took the fruit and held it like a gift from a world long lost, and he said, "I never wanted to fight. I joined to protect, not to destroy. I do not know who I am anymore, but I know I am not your enemy." She sat across from him slowly, with her legs crossed and her hands resting on her knees the same way her teachers once taught her when the temple was full of light and music, and she watched him eat in silence and listened to the way he chewed and swallowed and breathed. Like every act was a prayer of survival. He smiled at the taste and said, "It is strange but sweet, like something from home, but not from earth." And she said, "It grows only in places that have survived fire, only in soil that remembers death and still chooses life." They sat for a while longer, and he asked her name, and this time she gave it not as a secret, but as a gift, and she said, "Vera," and he repeated it like a song, like something sacred, and she let the sound fill the chamber like rain on dry stone. He told her his name again, Ryan, and she said it once, soft and careful, and he smiled because it sounded different in her voice, like it meant something more than just who he was. She stood and walked to another wall and touched a crystal hidden in the stone, and the room lit up slowly, revealing paintings and carvings of her people, of stars and stories and children laughing and creatures flying through clouds that no longer existed. And he stood beside her and saw the world through her eyes. He said, "This is beautiful," and she said, "This was before, and now it is only memory, but I keep it alive so I do not forget that we were more than war." They stood close now, not by accident, not by need, but by something growing like light after long night, and she reached out and touched his hand just for a moment, just long enough to feel warmth and pulse and the truth that he was real and here, and not like the ones who came before. He asked how she learned to heal, and she said, "It was given to me by my mother, and to her by hers, and passed down through hands that knew how to close wounds and open hearts. And now I give it to you, not because you are human, not because you are kind, but because I choose to." He felt a strange heat in his chest, and he touched his side where the wound had been, and it was gone. No scar, no pain, only smooth skin. And he looked at her with eyes wide and full of wonder, and she looked back without pride, without fear, only calm, only stillness. He said, "I feel stronger every hour, like something inside me is changing." And she said, "That is the root, that is the touch, that is the truth, that when healing begins, the body remembers how to be whole, and the soul remembers how to grow." The chamber grew quiet again, but not empty, not lonely, only full of something new, something small but strong, something that reached from him to her like a bridge made not of stone or words, but of trust. And when they finally slept, it was not the sleep of hiding or running or pain. It was the sleep of two hearts beating closer together in the quiet breath of peace. The sky outside turned black again, but this time not with night, but with fire and metal and machines that did not sleep and did not forget. And above, the broken temple ships moved like shadows cast by something cruel and patient, and the land below answered with silence deep. Inside the earth, behind stone older than memory, Ryan opened his eyes to the sound of distant engines and heavy boots and cold voices echoing through machines, and he sat up fast, his heart pounding, not from fear alone, but from the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers like sand in a storm. Vera stood near the crystal wall, her eyes fixed on a symbol glowing red, not from design, but from danger, and she knew this signal and what it meant, and she closed her eyes for one long breath before turning to face the truth. She did not want to speak. "They are coming back," she said, "not scouts this time, not trackers, not wanderers, but fire-bringers, soldiers from the high command. They will burn the ruins. If they sense you still breathe, they will burn me too." Ryan stood slowly, his legs strong now, his side healed, his body moving like it once did before the crash, before the pain, before the fear, and he walked to her and said, Then we run now, we escape, there has to be a way. Vera shook her head and her voice dropped low and steady. There is one way, but if we take it, we can never return, and if we do not take it, they will find you, and they will destroy this place and everything inside, and I cannot let that happen again. She turned to the far wall and placed her palm against a smooth piece of stone and whispered a code in her native tongue, and the wall trembled and then opened to a hidden tunnel, narrow and dark and pulsing with faint light, like the heartbeat of a world long forgotten. Ryan looked into the passage and said, "Then we go together. You saved me. I will not leave you here to face this alone." And Vera looked at him, and her eyes were full of something sharp and soft at once, like the edge of a blade wrapped in silk. "You do not understand," she said. "This path leads to the old transport chamber, one last pod buried under the mountain. It can carry one. It was made for escape, not rescue, and its energy core is too weak to hold more than one life at a time." Ryan stepped back, his breath caught in his throat, and the silence between them grew loud like thunder in a still valley. And then he said, "Then you take it, your people, your home, your healing, it all matters more than me." Vera took a step closer, and her hands trembled just enough to betray what she kept hidden, and she said, "I was ready to vanish. I was ready to be forgotten. Until you fell from the sky like a question I did not ask but could not ignore, and now you are part of this place, and I cannot choose myself over you, not again." He placed his hand over hers, and the light between their fingers grew brighter, not from power but from choice, from something deep and true, and he said, "Then we find another way, or we face them together." The sound of the engines grew louder, and the walls above them shook with distant impact, and dust rained down from the ceiling like falling ash, and still they stood there, eyes locked, hearts beating, not as two, not as enemies, not as stranger and widow, but as something new. Vera turned and moved into the tunnel, and Ryan followed, and the path narrowed and the light grew stronger, until they reached a chamber glowing with green energy, and at its center a pod shaped like a tear, frozen in time, silent and still waiting for a purpose it had never served. "This was built for my son," she said, "when we thought the war would come this far, when we hoped to save the future even if we lost the present, but he never reached it, and I sealed it away with the rest of my hope." Ryan walked to the pod and placed his hand on the surface and felt the hum of sleeping energy, and he looked at her and said, "If there is no choice, then you must take it, not because I want you to leave me, but because the world needs you more than it needs me." Vera looked at him, and for the first time in many years her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, not from fear, but from the weight of something real and human and alive, and she said, "I have lost everything once. I will not do it again, not even for the future above them." A sharp blast echoed through the mountain, and a crack split the ceiling, and light poured in from the outside, and Ryan knew they were out of time, and he stepped forward and opened the pod and turned back to her. "One last time, go now," he said, not as a soldier, not as a guest, but as someone who wanted her to live. She walked to him and placed her hand on his cheek, and her voice was only breath when she said, "You are hurt, human, but not just your body. I see your heart too." And without another word she pushed him gently into the pod and sealed it with one final command. And the chamber filled with light, and the floor began to rise, and Vera stepped back as the pod lifted toward the sky. She stood alone in the dark again, but this time with no fear and no regret, only the sound of a choice made for love, not survival. The pod broke through the stone above with a sound like thunder swallowed by wind, and then it rose higher through smoke and shadow, and light touched its silver shell as it pierced the black clouds that covered the mountain, and behind it the earth trembled under the weight of machines that knew only orders and targets and fire inside the pod. Ryan pressed his hands against the glass and looked down as the ruins disappeared beneath waves of dust and flame and metal, and he could not see her face, but he felt her there, standing where he once stood, watching him rise as she stayed rooted in silence and stone. He wanted to scream her name through the cold air that separated them, wanted to break the glass and fall back into the dark, wanted to be where she was, even if that meant facing death again, because it was no longer about escape, no longer about healing. It was about her, about Vera, about the choice she made and the one he never got to return. The pod carried him past the ridge where the enemy ships circled like hawks, with steel feathers and cold eyes, and for a moment he thought they would see him and shoot him from the sky. and he closed his eyes and thought of her hands glowing in the dark and her voice whispering, "You are hurt, human, let me heal you," and he knew that voice would follow him for the rest of his life. But the ships passed him and did not see, and the pod vanished into the cloud belt where signals broke and machines failed, and the sky swallowed him like a secret not yet ready to be known for. Below, the soldiers entered the chamber where the pod had rested and found only dust and silence and old light still flickering on the stone, and they saw the empty launch track and the burned seal of a house long forgotten, and they reported it as a failed rescue. Nothing of value, nothing left, nothing living. But in the deepest part of the ruin, Vera still stood with her back straight and her heart calm in her hands, pressed to the stone wall where his name was now carved by her own fingers into the memory of her world. And she whispered not goodbye, not farewell, only a promise in the language of her people that meant until again she walked back through the tunnel, past the empty healing shelves and the sleeping crystals, and the place where they had first spoken without words, and she touched each wall like touching the skin of something alive and ancient, and she knew this place would never feel empty. Again above the ruins the sky began to clear, and for the first time in many years a ray of golden light broke through the clouds and touched the ground not far from where Ryan had once crawled from the wreck of his ship, and in that light the dust shimmered and the wind carried no smoke, only silence and peace. In orbit the pod reached the emergency beacon drifting near a derelict station, and as it docked the system woke from sleep and sent a call across the stars, and somewhere on a distant Earth someone heard it, and someone moved to answer, and the light that had faded began to return. Ryan stepped from the pod with weak legs and a strong heart, and he looked at the stars above him and whispered her name, not loud, not desperate, only soft, like a prayer, like a song meant for no one else. And he knew she would not hear it with her ears, but maybe with something deeper. He did not tell them everything when they found him, did not speak of the alien widow or the healing or the choice or the stone temple buried in the mountain of a war-torn world. He only said, "I survived," and they believed it was enough, but he knew it was not the end, only the beginning. Time passed like quiet rain falling on memory, and each night he looked up and found the same star, the one that never moved, the one that marked a place where she waited, and he promised again and again with no voice and no words and no fear that he would return, not as a soldier, not as a broken man, not as a visitor, but as something more, as someone who carried her strength in his blood and her name in his chest and her healing in his soul. And on the planet below, Vera stood in the garden she had started with roots from the old chamber and water drawn from the last spring near the edge of the ruins, and she placed one stone for each memory and one flower for each pain and one light for each hope. She looked up at the sky each night and listened for a sound that only she would recognize, the low hum of a pod returning, not from war, not from duty, not from fear, but from a promise made in silence and carried through fire. And when the wind passed through the garden, she smiled, because she felt it in her bones, in her breath, in her blood, that he was coming, that he had not forgotten, that he would find her again, because she had healed him and he had saved her. And what they shared was not born from peace and not shaped by battle, but carved by choice in a world that never believed in such things, but they did, and that was enough.